When the Cromwell tank first rolled onto the battlefields of Europe in 1944, it didn't roar, it sprinted. German soldiers who had long sneered at British armor for being slow and clumsy suddenly found themselves staring at something that moved with shocking speed. In a war dominated by heavy machines and grinding attrition, the Cromwell was different. It was lean, fast, and unrelenting, a tank designed to outthink and outrun its enemy. In the ruins of Normandy's hedgerows, where the war was a deadly chess game of movement and concealment, the Cromwell's speed became its weapon. The German infantry called it Der Windpanzer, the wind tank. It seemed to appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish before their anti-tank guns could even traverse. For the first time since the start of the war, British armor wasn't chasing history, it was rewriting it. The Cromwell story began years earlier, born from failure. The early British cruiser tanks of the North African desert had been fast. Yes, but fragile. Their thin armor and weak guns had made them prey for German panzers and the dreaded 88 millimeter. Yet in those brutal lessons of El Alamein and Tobruk, engineers and officers began to craft a new idea. What if speed could become a weapon in itself? What if a tank could strike before the enemy even knew it was there? By 1943, the answer had arrived in prototype form. A sleek, low-slung machine powered by the new Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, derived from the legendary Merlin that had carried Spitfires through the Battle of Britain. The Meteor gave the Cromwell power unlike anything the British Army had ever seen. Where most Allied tanks struggled to reach 25 miles per hour, the Cromwell could exceed 40. On open roads, it was almost impossible to catch. When the Cromwell was first demonstrated to the troops, it stunned even its own commanders. British officers watched as the tank accelerated across rough ground, leaping over ridges, its suspension absorbing the punishment without a groan. Soldiers used to lumbering Churchills or standard Shermans stared in disbelief. Here was a tank that didn't crawl. It ran. German soldiers, however, wouldn't meet it until Normandy. In the chaos after D-Day, as British armored divisions pushed inland through the tangled bocage, the Cromwells made their mark. Fast, maneuverable, and surprisingly agile for their weight, they became the spearheads of British reconnaissance units, able to move faster than the enemy could react. For the Germans, used to facing slower and heavier foes, the shock was immediate. In early engagements near Villers-Bocage, reports began filtering through German lines describing unusually fast British tanks. At first, the accounts were dismissed as exaggerations, until Tiger crews found themselves outflanked in terrain where they believed no Allied tank could maneuver. The Cromwell couldn't match the Tiger's armor or gunpowder, but it didn't need to. It relied on something no German tank possessed: speed and flexibility. It could appear at one end of a field, fire, and be gone before the Tiger could rotate its massive turret. To the Germans who faced it, the experience was maddening. A ghost made of steel. And that was just the beginning. In the weeks following D-Day, Cromwell units began racing across the countryside, outpacing supply convoys, communication lines, and sometimes even their own infantry. German spotters tracking the movement of British armor often reported impossible distances covered in a single day. A tank that moved this fast shouldn't exist. Not in mud, not in rain, not under fire. But the Cromwell did exist. It was the realization of Britain's long-delayed answer to Blitzkrieg, a machine that could finally fight on German terms and win. And when it came roaring out of the morning mist, the German soldiers, who had once laughed at British tanks, stopped laughing altogether. The legend of the Cromwell had begun. By the second week after D-Day, the Cromwell had become a name whispered across German radio transmissions. Panzer commanders who had grown accustomed to slow, methodical British advances were suddenly facing something different, something unnerving. It wasn't that the Cromwell was everywhere, it was that it could be anywhere. Reports arrived of British tanks appearing behind German lines only minutes after contact had been made at the front. For men used to dictating the tempo of armored warfare, this was disorienting. The Germans had built their armor around dominance through firepower and armor thickness. Their Tigers and Panthers were engineering masterpieces, machines meant to crush opponents in head-on engagements. But the Cromwell changed the rules. Its armor was thinner, its gun modest compared to a Tiger's, but it moved like no other tank on the Western Front. While the Germans maneuvered with precision, the Cromwell fought with unpredictability. It struck from the flanks, darted into cover, and used its speed to survive where heavier tanks would have died. One German officer later wrote, "We had prepared for lions, but what came for us were hawks." He wasn't exaggerating. The Cromwell could travel faster than any tank the Germans fielded, sometimes twice as fast. Its Meteor engine roared with an intensity that was unmistakable, but by the time soldiers heard it, the tank was already upon them. The combination of speed and surprise turned what was supposed to be a slow grind through Normandy into something far more dynamic. In early July 1944, during the Battle for Hill 112, Cromwell's of the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, made their presence felt. They were tasked with reconnaissance and rapid strikes, not direct confrontation. Still, in the rolling farmlands west of Caen, they found themselves facing German armor head-on. The Cromwells couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the Tigers, but they didn't try to. Instead, they darted from cover to cover, using the terrain like a weapon. They struck at the exposed sides of Panthers, firing their 75mm guns, and retreated before the German gunners could respond. It was armored guerrilla warfare, speed as both sword and shield. The German crews were unaccustomed to this. Their training had focused on deliberate, calculated exchanges, slow, methodical duels that rewarded discipline and coordination. But the Cromwells turned the battlefield into chaos. Their commanders relied on constant movement, fast communication, and instinct. German officers watching through binoculars described them as impossible to pin down, like insects that refused to stand still long enough to be swatted. The results were staggering. The Cromwell's ability to close gaps, exploit weaknesses, and harass retreating units forced the Germans to divert heavier tanks away from key positions just to deal with them. Entire supply columns were ambushed, artillery positions overrun. What the British lacked in raw firepower, they made up for in velocity and precision. It wasn't just the tank's speed that made it dangerous. It was how it multiplied the reach of its commanders. British reconnaissance units could now scout kilometers ahead of their main force, feeding live intelligence to headquarters. The Cromwell gave the British Army something it had sorely lacked since 1940: momentum. To the Germans, the experience was deeply unsettling. They had mocked British armor for years, pointing to the early disasters of the war, the clumsy Matilda, the underpowered Crusader. But now the same enemy had built a machine that could move faster than any Panzer and still fight effectively. For once, it was the Germans who felt outmaneuvered. In the days that followed, captured German reports carried a recurring line: "Beware the fast British tank." They no longer underestimated it. The Cromwell was no longer just a curiosity, it was a warning. And deep inside the German command structure, one uneasy realization began to take shape. The British had finally learned the art of mechanized warfare that Germany had once perfected. Only now the tables were turning. By mid-July 1944, as the Allies pressed deeper into Normandy, the Cromwell's legend was growing faster than the tank itself could move. It had become the backbone of British armored reconnaissance, leading the charge through broken hedgerows, mud-choked lanes, and smoking ruins. The tank's low profile and blistering acceleration made it a nightmare for German artillery spotters. They could aim, but by the time the shells landed, the Cromwell had already vanished behind another rise in the terrain. What set the Cromwell apart wasn't just its speed, it was the way it changed the rhythm of battle. The German army had always relied on control, timing, precision, formation. But the Cromwell disrupted that. It turned skirmishes into running duels, ambushes into fleeting opportunities. German officers were forced to react rather than dictate. For an army built on calculated tempo, that was chaos. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine was the beating heart of this transformation. Derived from the same design that powered Spitfires in the skies, it gave the Cromwell nearly 600 horsepower, a staggering figure for a 28-ton tank. It could accelerate from a standstill faster than any armored vehicle on the Western Front, and it could maintain high speed across uneven terrain that would have broken the suspensions of heavier German tanks. One British tanker from the 11th Armored Division later recalled, "It felt alive, like it wanted to move faster than we could handle. If a tiger was a boulder, the Cromwell was a storm." His words captured the essence of the tank: unpredictable, mobile, relentless. In the bocage country of Normandy, this speed became its deadliest advantage. The dense hedgerows that slowed Shermans and Churchills barely hindered Cromwell's. Their power-to-weight ratio allowed them to punch through gaps, race along narrow lanes, and circle enemy flanks before they could reposition. During the fighting near Villers-Bocage, several Cromwells managed to outmaneuver German positions by racing through side roads that even motorbikes would have hesitated to take. When they emerged from the trees, they struck supply columns, scattering soldiers and vehicles in panic. For German infantrymen, the sight was surreal. They were used to hearing the thunder of heavy tanks long before they arrived. The Firefly's booming gun, the Churchill's groaning tracks, all familiar. But the Cromwell was different. It moved with an almost unnatural speed. Soldiers reported hearing a sudden roar, then seeing a blur of motion, a tank racing past before their machine guns could even pivot. It wasn't supposed to be possible. And when the Cromwells hit German armor, they did it on their own terms. They didn't charge straight at the Tigers or Panthers. They circled them, harassing from angles those massive turrets couldn't turn to cover in time. A Tiger could crush a Cromwell in a single hit, but only if it could land one. More often than not, the Fireflies followed up behind, taking advantage of the positions the faster Cromwells created. Together, they became a lethal pairing: speed and power, mobility and precision. By August, the Germans were adapting, setting ambushes and repositioning their heavier tanks to counter the new British threat. But even then, they found themselves chasing ghosts. Cromwells used the terrain with surgical cunning. If spotted, they moved. If cornered, they flanked. The German High Command began issuing new orders. If possible, avoid engaging British reconnaissance tanks directly. That alone spoke volumes. But the Cromwell wasn't invincible. Its armor was thin, vulnerable to nearly every anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal. A single well-placed shot could end it. What saved its crews was that speed again: velocity as survival. As one German gunner put it after capture, "It was like trying to hit smoke with a hammer." By the time Allied forces prepared for the breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, the Cromwell had already proven its worth. It was no longer a curiosity or an experiment. It was a force multiplier. Every time it appeared, it threw German plans into disarray. And with each engagement, the soldiers who once mocked it grew quieter. The tank they'd laughed at had become the one they feared most to chase. By late July 1944, the British armored spearheads were no longer creeping through Normandy. They were slicing through it. The Cromwell, once seen as a supporting role in the great Allied advance, had now become the tip of the blade. The tank's blistering mobility allowed British commanders to perform a maneuver the Germans themselves had perfected in 1940. Fast, deep penetration into enemy lines. And for the first time, it was the German soldiers watching helplessly as an opponent moved faster than they could counter. When Operation Cobra unleashed the American breakout to the west, the British launched their own to the east, Operation Bluecoat. Here, in the tangled countryside between Caumont and Vire, Cromwell tanks of the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, found their greatest test. The terrain was brutal. Narrow lanes, deep ditches, thick hedges, and ambush points everywhere. But the Cromwell thrived in conditions that would have crippled heavier armor. Its crews learned to fight with rhythm, sprint, strike, disappear. German anti-tank teams would aim for where the Cromwell was, only to find it gone a moment later, engines howling somewhere else. The British didn't need overwhelming firepower. They used momentum as their weapon. The Meteor engine could propel them at nearly 40 miles per hour on open ground, but even at half that speed through the bocage, they were unmatched. The German defenders, many of them veterans from the Eastern Front, could hardly believe it. They had faced T-34s and KV tanks, but nothing like this. The Cromwell's combination of speed and agility defied their expectations. When captured later, one German officer admitted, "We thought the English tanks were slow and careful. The Cromwell moved like cavalry. reckless and precise at once. On August 2nd, near the village of Montchamp, a squadron of Cromwell's executed one of the most daring armored maneuvers of the campaign. A German position had stalled the advance, a mix of Panthers and dug-in infantry supported by 88mm guns. The terrain made a frontal assault suicide, but the Cromwell commanders decided to do the impossible. Outflanked through terrain the Germans believed impassable for tanks. Moving under cover of dawn mist, the Cromwells raced through narrow paths, across uneven fields, even bursting through hedges and farm fences. Their engines thundered in unison, and before the Germans could react, the tanks were behind their lines. When the British opened fire, chaos erupted. German gunners spun their weapons too late. Within minutes, the strong point collapsed. What should have been a prolonged battle turned into a rout. The Germans had learned to fear the Firefly's gun, but the Cromwell taught them to fear movement itself. They began spreading false reports of multiple armored units where only a few Cromwells operated, confusing their own command structures. A tank that could appear in 3 places in a single hour had become more dangerous than an entire division. And yet, for all its success, the Cromwell was not immune to loss. Many of its crews paid the price for its thin armor and daring tactics. A single hit from a Panther or an 88mm gun could ignite the tank like a torch. Veterans described the smell of scorched fuel and steel, the haunting echo of a Meteor engine dying mid-gear. But still, they climbed back in, because they knew that speed was their only protection, and hesitation their death sentence. By mid-August, the Cromwells had done what no British tank had achieved since the beginning of the war. They had earned the respect of the enemy. Reports from retreating German units described the fast English tanks that seemed to appear from thin air, cutting supply roads and ambushing columns before disappearing again. To the German infantry slogging through the mud of retreat, it was demoralizing. To their officers, it was baffling. But to the British tankers who had spent years being outpaced by their foes, it was vindication. The Cromwell wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A machine that moved with the determination of the nation that built it. And now, as the Allied front began to surge forward, the Cromwell's greatest race was yet to come, across France itself. By late August 1944, the race across France had begun, and the Cromwell was leading it. The breakout from Normandy had torn the German front apart, and now British and Canadian armored divisions poured through the gap like a steel tide. Roads once packed with retreating Wehrmacht units were now littered with wreckage, burning fuel trucks, and abandoned tanks. And cutting through it all were the Cromwells, engines roaring, tracks clattering, dust and exhaust trailing behind them like smoke from some unstoppable storm. For months, British tankers had fought for inches in the hedgerows. Now at last they were free to move, and they moved like lightning. On open roads, the Cromwell's true nature was unleashed. While Sherman's and Churchill's advanced methodically, the Cromwells streaked ahead, scouting routes, encircling towns, and striking deep behind enemy lines. They were the eyes and speed of the British Army, fast enough to outrun trouble and clever enough to bring it back upon the enemy. German soldiers, exhausted and disorganized, began to call them Die schnellen Schatten, the fast shadows. The nickname was apt. Cromwells would appear on the horizon, guns flashing, only to vanish down side roads moments later. Supply convoys were hit without warning, bridges captured before demolition charges could be set. The Wehrmacht was fighting not just an enemy army, but time itself. One of the most remarkable examples came during the rapid advance toward the Seine. The 11th Armored Division, equipped with Cromwells, was ordered to cut off the German retreat east of Falaise. The operation demanded speed over caution, the very condition the Cromwell was born for. In less than 36 hours, the division advanced more than 70 miles through enemy territory, engaging pockets of resistance, destroying artillery batteries, and seizing crossings before they could be blown. German officers were stunned. Their own panzers, superior on paper, couldn't match the pace. The heavy Panthers and Tigers consumed too much fuel, broke down too easily, and bogged in soft ground. The Cromwells, lighter and mechanically reliable, raced past the wrecks. Every time the Germans tried to reform a defensive line, the British were already behind it. Captured Wehrmacht diaries from the period reveal their disbelief. One officer wrote, "We faced a new British tank, very fast, low, impossible to target. It drives as if possessed. We could not react in time." Another noted grimly, "Our tanks are too slow to stop them." They are everywhere. The British tankers knew their machines weren't invincible. They lacked the thick armor of the Churchill or the killing power of the Firefly, but they had something far more decisive: initiative. The Cromwell turned its crews into hunters. With superior speed and coordination, they could choose their fights. If the odds were bad, they retreated before the Germans could react. If they found an opening, they struck with precision. For many of the young men inside, the sense of motion itself became intoxicating. After years of fighting defensively, they were finally driving the enemy backward. One crewman from the 7th Armored Division recalled, "The roads were full of smoke and wrecks, but we didn't stop. We felt untouchable, like nothing could catch us now." But the speed came with danger. The Cromwells often advanced too far ahead, outrunning their own support. German ambushes armed with Panzerfausts and 88mm guns waited along crossroads and villages. Many Cromwells were lost this way, burned out husks left smoking in ditches. Yet even that didn't slow the advance. Another tank would simply take its place, roaring forward to keep the pressure on. By early September, the British had reached Brussels. Crowds filled the streets, cheering as Cromwells thundered past, their crews waving from open hatches. The sleek tanks, still streaked with mud and dust from France, symbolized something larger than victory. They were proof that Britain, once mocked for its slow armor and outdated tactics, had built something capable of outpacing even the vaunted German war machine. But the war wasn't over. Ahead lay the rivers, forests, and towns of Northern Europe. And with them, the final challenge for the Cromwell and the men who drove it. The German army, though broken, was not yet defeated. And in the fields beyond the Rhine, the Cromwell would face its greatest test. Not of speed, but of endurance. By the time autumn arrived in 1944, the Cromwell had raced across France and Belgium like a mechanical whirlwind. The British Army's confidence was soaring. They had broken through, liberated cities, and forced the German war machine into a desperate retreat. But as they neared the Dutch border, the nature of the war changed. The wide-open roads that had once favored the Cromwell's speed now turned into bottlenecks of mud, flooded fields, and narrow canals. What had been a sprint across France became a grind through Northern Europe's brutal terrain. The German army, though battered, was far from finished. In Holland, they made their stand, using the terrain to their advantage, flooding the lowlands and digging in behind dikes, canals, and forests. For the Cromwell crews, it was a new kind of battlefield. Their engines still roared with the same ferocity, but the ground beneath them was soft, treacherous, and unpredictable. Every burst of acceleration risked bogging down in the mud. The tank built for speed now had to fight in places where speed could kill. Yet even here, the Cromwell found ways to excel. Its powerful engine and responsive suspension gave it an edge over heavier tanks. Where the massive Tigers and Panthers sank or stalled, the Cromwell could still maneuver, weaving through narrow causeways, pushing through flooded fields, and darting along embankments under fire. The British tankers adapted their tactics. Instead of lightning-fast breakouts, they used precision and coordination, striking suddenly, vanishing again before German guns could find them. In one fierce encounter near the Dutch town of Overloon, Cromwells of the 7th Armored Division faced entrenched German positions supported by anti-tank guns and Panthers. The weather was miserable. Constant rain, low visibility, and mud deep enough to swallow vehicles whole. Yet when a German counterattack threatened to overrun British infantry, the Cromwells surged forward through terrain no one believed they could cross. Their engines screamed, treads throwing mud like waves, shells whistling overhead. Within minutes, they had broken through, their speed and shock enough to scatter the attackers. It was the same weapon that had served them in France. Momentum, but now it had to be applied with discipline. German reports from this period reveal a growing frustration. The British tanks move even when they should not, one field officer wrote. They attack through ground we consider impassable. Their mobility is unnatural. That mobility had become psychological warfare. Even when the British weren't attacking, The Germans believed they were. Every sound of an engine in the distance brought tension. Still, the cost was mounting. The Cromwell's thin armor, once compensated for by speed, was now a vulnerability in close, static fighting. German 75mm and 88mm guns tore through it easily. Crews learned to fight smart, using terrain, smoke, and coordination to stay alive. Every maneuver became a gamble, every sprint a calculated risk. Yet morale remained high. The tankers knew what their machines could do, and their trust in the Cromwell was absolute. They had learned to use its agility as an extension of instinct, to feel the rhythm of the engine and know when to strike. It wasn't the biggest gun that mattered, one commander later said. It was being where the enemy didn't expect you to be. As the front pushed east toward the German border, the Cromwell's role began to shift again. The Allies were no longer chasing a retreating enemy. They were hammering into the last defenses of the Reich. The terrain grew tighter, the resistance fiercer. But wherever reconnaissance was needed, wherever speed and initiative were the difference between success and disaster, the Cromwell was sent first. It had begun as a machine built from necessity. Now it was the vanguard of victory, a symbol of British adaptability, engineering, and sheer willpower. And soon it would race through the final chapter of the war, into Germany itself. By early 1945, the Cromwell's tracks were cutting into German soil. The frozen landscape of the Reich was a far cry from the open plains of France, but the British tankers pressed on, engines howling in the bitter cold. What had begun as a desperate improvisation years earlier was now one of the key machines driving the final Allied advance. The Cromwell, lean and fast, was still leading the charge, and the German soldiers who faced it were learning, often too late, that speed could be more terrifying than armor. As the Allies crossed the Rhine, the German army was in disarray. Broken units retreated through ruined towns, supply lines collapsed, and morale crumbled. Yet even in defeat, the Wehrmacht fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. For the Cromwell crews, that meant danger at every turn. Hidden Panzerfaust teams, mines, and ambushes waiting in every village street. The days of sweeping, open warfare were over. Now the battle was house to house, street to street. In these close fights, the Cromwell's agility became a lifeline. While heavier tanks struggled to navigate narrow lanes or sharp turns, the Cromwell pivoted with ease, weaving between rubble and buildings. Its engine roared like thunder in the confined streets, echoing off shattered walls. German soldiers crouched with rocket launchers would fire and miss as the British tanks darted across intersections faster than they could react. One engagement in the city of Münster illustrated the Cromwell's ferocity. As British infantry advanced under fire, a column of Cromwells charged through the main street, their 75mm guns firing point blank into enemy positions. When a Panther attempted to block the advance, the Cromwells split, racing into side alleys and re-emerging behind it. Their shells struck the Panther's exposed rear, setting it ablaze. The Germans had no time to recover. The Cromwells were gone as quickly as they'd appeared. To the German soldiers who survived such encounters, it felt impossible. British tanks had once been predictable, slow-moving targets. Now they seemed alive, quick, instinctive, relentless. The Cromwell's reputation had evolved from curiosity to nightmare. As the war ground toward its end, the Cromwell's crews pushed themselves and their machines to the limit. Long days of fighting were followed by sleepless nights repairing engines, replacing treads, patching bullet holes. The tanks, though battered, refused to die. Mechanics marveled that the Meteor engines still roared after months of nonstop combat. Even with the cold freezing oil lines and the mud caking every surface, the Cromwell endured. The men who fought in them had come to trust the tank like a living thing. It had carried them through Normandy, across France, through Belgium and Holland, and now into Germany itself. To them, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was survival. Many crews painted names on their hulls: Comet Queen, Thunder Run, Fury's Shadow. These names carried weight, echoes of friends lost, of miles fought for, of victories won at a cost. In the ruined landscapes of Western Germany, The Cromwell's presence was often the first sign to civilians that the war was ending. Children peered from cellar doors as the sleek British tanks rolled by, engines humming instead of growling, their white stars and division markings streaked with mud. The sight was surreal, a machine built for war now symbolizing the collapse of tyranny. Even German officers, when captured, could not deny their respect. One remarked bitterly to his interrogator, "The Cromwell, that's how tanks should move." He wasn't wrong. The British had achieved what few armies ever had. They had turned their weakness into strength, their mockery into mastery. But for all the triumph, the war wasn't yet over. Ahead lay the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, and the last major defensive stand. The Cromwells would be there again, leading the advance into the fire. The tank that had once been dismissed as too light, too fast, too British, was about to help in the greatest war in history. By March 1945, the Cromwells were thundering through the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland and its final defensive stronghold. The skies were gray with smoke and ash. Factories stood gutted, bridges collapsed, and rivers ran thick with the remnants of a dying empire. Yet amid the destruction, the familiar sound of the Meteor engines echoed through the valleys. A deep, powerful growl that announced the British were coming. The Cromwell was no longer a supporting player in the Allied arsenal. It was a frontline predator. In a campaign defined by attrition, it had proven that mobility could crush even the most fortified defenses. Every British advance into the Ruhr began the same way. Reconnaissance Cromwell sweeping ahead, their speed uncovering enemy ambushes before the slower, heavier tanks could blunder into them. The German soldiers still fighting there quickly learned that the first tank they saw was rarely the last. The Cromwell's arrival meant the rest of the British army wasn't far behind. But this was not the fast-moving war of France or Belgium. The Ruhr campaign was grueling, fought in choking dust in shattered cities. The German defenders used every weapon they had left. 88mm guns hidden in factory windows, Panzerfausts in basements, artillery fire directed from church towers. The Cromwell crews had to adapt again. They learned to use their agility not just for attack, but for survival. Darting between cover, reversing quickly after each shot, staying in constant motion. A stationary tank was a dead tank, and they knew it. In the city of Essen, one of Germany's last major industrial centers, a squadron of Cromwells from the 11th Armored Division made a daring push through the bombed-out streets. The terrain was a labyrinth of debris and wreckage. German anti-tank guns covered every major intersection. But the Cromwells didn't hesitate. They split into pairs, darting through side alleys and factory yards, engines screaming as they burst into open squares, firing and disappearing again before the Germans could retaliate. Within hours, the defenders were broken, not by overwhelming firepower, but by relentless speed. By now, even the German officers acknowledged the transformation. One after-action report, recovered from the ruins of a Panzer Battalion headquarters, read simply, "The British tanks move like ghosts. They attack before we can adjust." For an army that had once prided itself on maneuver warfare, it was a bitter irony. The British had mastered the very strategy the Germans had pioneered. Still, the toll on the Cromwell crews was immense. Fatigue, stress, and the psychological strain of constant combat weighed heavily. They lived in their tanks, slept in them, ate in them, bled in them. Each Cromwell bore the scars of 100 engagements: scorched armor, bullet pockmarks, shattered fenders, tracks patched with salvaged parts. Yet the machines kept moving, a testament to both the engineers who built them and the men who refused to let them die. The closer they pushed to the Rhine, the more surreal the war became. German resistance flickered between fanaticism and surrender. Some towns fought to the last. Others greeted the British with white flags. Through it all, the Cromwells pressed forward, faster, always faster. When they reached the Rhine crossings, the Germans had destroyed most of the bridges. But the Cromwell's agility allowed it to ford smaller rivers and maneuver across makeshift crossings where heavier tanks could not. Again and again, it proved what its designers had envisioned: mobility as the ultimate weapon. For the German soldiers watching them race across the landscape, the disbelief remained. These were British tanks, the same army whose armor they had mocked for years as slow and outdated. Yet now those same tanks were leading the charge into Germany itself, and deep in the shattered factories of the Ruhr, where once the panzers had been forged, the irony was complete. The engineers who had built the mightiest armored force in history could only watch as a lean, fast, unassuming British tank roared past their ruins, a living symbol that their age of dominance was over. The Cromwell had not just caught up with the Germans, it had surpassed them. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. But for the Cromwell crews, it was far from over. The closer they came to Berlin, the fiercer the resistance became. German soldiers, many little more than boys, fought from cellars and forests, determined to delay the inevitable. For the British tankers, exhaustion was now their constant companion. Yet every time the order came to move, the Meteor engines roared back to life, and the Cromwells surged forward once more. The British advance into northern Germany became a race, not just against the remnants of the Wehrmacht, but against time itself. The Soviets were approaching Berlin from the east, and the Western Allies wanted to secure as much territory as possible before the war ended. The Cromwells, with their unmatched speed and reliability, were the natural vanguard. They raced ahead of the infantry, securing towns and crossings, cutting off retreating German units before they could regroup. In one remarkable drive near the city of Lübeck, Cromwells of the 7th Armored Division covered nearly 70 miles in a single day. They bypassed resistance where possible, outflanking strong points, destroying convoys, and spreading confusion deep behind German lines. For the Germans, this was unthinkable. Tanks weren't supposed to move that far, that fast through contested territory. They tried to counter with roadblocks and ambushes, but the Cromwells were always one step ahead. At one crossroads, a German column of trucks and half-tracks attempted to retreat eastward. The lead Cromwell, traveling at full speed, came roaring over a hill and opened fire before the Germans even realized what had happened. Shells tore through the convoy, scattering vehicles and men in every direction. Within minutes, the road was littered with wrecks. The Cromwell didn't linger. It fired, then moved, always in motion. By this stage of the war, the psychological effect of the Cromwell was as powerful as its gun. German troops often mistook it for something far larger because of the sheer ferocity of its approach. A tank that could appear, strike, and disappear in moments seemed almost supernatural. Soldiers who once laughed at the light British tanks now surrendered at the mere sound of a fast-approaching engine. But the Cromwell crews were not untouched by the cost of their campaign. Their tanks had carried them across an entire continent. The machines were scarred, patched together with spare parts, and worn to their limits. Crews kept their engines running with improvisation and luck, using captured fuel, salvaged track links, and welding armor plates scavenged from wrecks. Many of the men had been fighting continuously since Normandy. Every town captured, every bridge crossed, brought them closer to home, but also reminded them of how far they'd come. The Cromwell, too, bore its history. Some had names stenciled on their turrets: King's Arrow, Hell's Wager, Cavalier's Pride. Others carried chalk marks for every enemy vehicle destroyed. For all their speed and daring, they had seen the cost up close. Burned out wrecks of their comrades' tanks, the blackened shells of machines that had gone too far, too fast. As they reached the River Elbe in late April, the war was nearly done. The Cromwells had outrun even their own supply columns, pausing only to refuel before pressing on again. The towns they entered were shattered, but the fighting spirit that had driven them since Normandy burned just as bright. The British tankers were still pushing forward, still hunting for the last pockets of resistance, still proving that their machine, once underestimated, once mocked, had become one of the finest armored vehicles in the war. German officers captured in those final days couldn't hide their disbelief. One of them, a veteran of the panzer divisions in France, simply shook his head and said, "Your tanks are faster than our thoughts." It was a statement born not of flattery, but of resignation. The age of the German panzer had ended, and it had been outrun by the very army it once dismissed. For the Cromwell crews, victory was close enough to taste. They had crossed nations, outmaneuvered legends, and defied every expectation. But there was one last march ahead, the drive to meet the Russians on the Baltic coast and close the final chapter of the European War. The engines were still warm when the next order came. Move east. By early May 1945, the thunder of war was fading across Europe. The once invincible German war machine had collapsed, and the Allied armies were sweeping across the last fragments of resistance. For the men of the British armored divisions, and especially those in their Cromwells, it was the final sprint of a long and unforgiving journey. The order came quietly: advance to the Baltic. The goal was to link up with Soviet forces and cut off any last attempt by the remnants of the German army to flee into Denmark. The Cromwells were chosen to lead the charge. They had earned that honor 100 times over. Their speed, reliability, and spirit made them the perfect weapon for one last race across enemy territory. They drove through shattered villages and ghostly forests, where the air still smelled of gunpowder and smoke. The roads were choked with refugees, Wehrmacht deserters, and the burned-out skeletons of vehicles. Yet the Cromwells pressed on, engines roaring, turrets scanning, crews grimly focused. They were no longer chasing victory, they were chasing closure. Outside the city of Lübeck on May 3, 1945, the Cromwells of the 7th Armored Division reached the Baltic coast. There, on the windswept shores, they met the Red Army advancing from the east. The two forces stared at each other warily across the ruins of the Third Reich. The long-promised meeting between the Allies finally realized. For the Cromwell crews, it was a moment that felt unreal. The tanks that had raced from Normandy, through France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany, had finally reached the end of their war. Their machines bore the marks of every mile. The once sleek armor was pitted and scarred, streaked with rust and soot. Many tanks had been repaired more times than anyone could count. Some bore new parts from other destroyed Cromwells, cobbled together in field workshops. But they still ran. They had outrun everything: the enemy, the elements, even time itself. When the news of Germany's unconditional surrender arrived days later, there were no cheers among the tankers, only silence. The men sat on their turrets, staring out at the sea, letting the engines idle for the last time. They thought of the friends they had lost, the endless road behind them, and the strange bond they had formed with the machines that had carried them through it all. The Cromwell's war was over, but its legacy was just beginning. It had started as a gamble. A tank rushed into service to fill a desperate need. Many had doubted it. Some had even laughed at the idea that Britain could build a tank to rival the German panzers. But it had done more than rival them. It had outmaneuvered them, outlasted them, and in the end, helped bring them down. German soldiers who had once sneered at British armor were now forced to admit the truth. The Cromwell had proven that speed, reliability, and adaptability could triumph over brute force. It was not the heaviest nor the most powerful, but it was the tank that never stopped moving. After the war, the Cromwell continued to serve for years, a reminder of the balance between engineering brilliance and battlefield necessity. But for the men who drove them, its memory was more than mechanical. It was a symbol of defiance, proof that courage, ingenuity, and sheer willpower could turn a laughingstock into a legend. When the last Cromwells were finally retired, their engines silenced and their hulls placed in museums, veterans would sometimes visit them, running their hands along the cold steel, remembering the sound of that meteor engine and the way it had once made the ground tremble beneath them. The Germans had laughed when they first heard of the Cromwell. They didn't laugh when they saw it, and when they faced it, when they watched that fast, deadly silhouette streak across the battlefield. They realized too late what it meant. The British had built not just a tank, but a force of nature, and it raced straight into history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.